Again, my name is Noel Datko, and I am a partner here with Eide Bailey, and I'm ultimately responsible for our CRM consulting practice. I have been with Eide Bailey for about 10 years now, and I've been working in the Salesforce ecosystem for going on 20. And so what I want to focus on today, and especially since we have a fairly intimate group, feel free to ask questions and dig into any specifics that you might like. But what I'd like to focus on today is realistically understanding what it takes to actually get the most out of Salesforce. And part of my background here is I did a lot of graduate work in organizational performance and change and how we tie out humans and systems together to get the most of what we're trying to achieve. So one of the core things that I like to work with my clients around is helping them understand how to set up their organization in the most beneficial way that they can to achieve the results that they're looking for from their technology investment. So it's not just Salesforce. These things will apply in many other areas, but in Salesforce or other CRMs, these things are pretty essential to doing well because the rules that govern what you can do in a CRM are a lot more flexible than what you might experience in an ERP or a regulated type of environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about just the general logistics. What do we need to consider to do this well? And then we'll talk about how do we actually do that? And then what's the roadmap to actually get some return on investment for what we're looking to achieve over any given period of time. So this first slide that we're looking at here is all around understanding the complexity that we're dealing with in an organization. So organizations come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and Salesforce in particular is really designed to be a scalable, flexible platform that allows you to accommodate whatever your needs might be, however you might like to do them. And so as you think about where your organization is in its current life cycle, there's a number of matrix items that we might want to look at. So, the first thing that we want to think about is procedurally and from a maturity perspective within an organization, how well do we know what we want to do and how we want to do that, in addition to this idea of how stable are those processes in what we're trying to accomplish. And the reason that that's important to consider is as you embark on any sort of software implementation where you might be doing configuration or writing custom code for whatever it might be, you need to keep in mind the level of effort that you're actually going to put into building something, using something, and maintaining something. And so if ultimately you're going to put a ton of effort into building something, and then you come to find out as you go to use that, largely a couple of things happen in that scenario where maybe you're a little immature in the organization and you're changing things, or the process complexity is designed to be overly burdensome. You get into the use and you find that either you did way too much in terms of building that system out, or your processes are changing. And because you've built this fairly complex environment with a lot of governing rules and principles and other things that you may have baked into that, that it's going to be very expensive to actually maintain, and you're going to get very minimal use out of that. So understanding where you are in your organization should influence the design of what you're trying to build to a fairly substantial degree, knowing that you can roadmap a lot of these pieces and put them together. But we find that many organizations maybe overestimate the level of maturity that they're at, underestimate the level of complexity that is actually going to go into the implementation of this. And without knowing those things, you're going to set yourself up for a lot of scope creep and some significant challenges there. So getting a good handle on where you are in kind of that matrix is important. The other piece of that is not just the technical design of what's happening, but how do we get there with the people that are engaged in this process? So this is another consideration in terms of organizational maturity, overall expectations that folks have, and the level of effort that it's going to take to get there. So if we say, hey, we have a somewhat immature organization in terms of process, but we have highly complex business models that we have to deal with. And then we've got a lot of silos or very challenging stakeholders that we have to deal with who want really high levels of engagement where we're documenting everything. We're having to double, triple check multiple meetings with multiple people on every type of process that's happening there. Understanding that is going to get likely very expensive, and it's going to take a lot longer to implement your environment than what you might see in you know, a lower complexity, lower friction type situation and scenario. And so again, recognizing the degree of engagement, the degree of sophistication, the degree of expectations of the people and who all is involved there. This is another critical area for us to be really honest with ourselves and say, hey, what are my expectations on whatever software it is that we're working with for what I'm trying to get out of that, and really match those to the scope, the budget, the timeline that you want to expect for a project. So all three of those things are likely to get expanded as we move farther up and to the right in both of these areas. And again, feel free to ask any questions as we continue through this deck. But as you think about what you want to accomplish and you think about engaging your stakeholders, there's, again, what we're showing here, a methodology to doing this well. So as you think about who you're going to engage throughout the course of any sort of software implementations, it's critical that you think about the right people being involved and how they're going to influence and how they're going to absorb the information that we're working together on. So I'll talk about essentially a fairly simple Sales Cloud implementation as an example. So generally, we look at doing a Sales Cloud implementation because we want to assist our sales and marketing teams to become more cohesive, to handle more throughput, and to be more effective at essentially closing and winning opportunities. And so as you think about doing that, and you evaluate who are the stakeholders that need to be involved, we want to start breaking those stakeholders up into these areas that you see on the screen, right? So our sales users may not be the most effective users to have fully engaged in kind of the co-creation process here of designing what the system's going to do, exactly how it's going to work and where it's going to go. But we need them to be fully bought in on using the system and using it well and having the system benefit them. So they would really fall likely into that inspire, or to a certain extent, enable categories here in this type of implementation. If you think about your C-suite, you know, CEO, CFO, COO, other folks who generally have high-level titles in an organization, unless they're super intimately involved in defining these processes, which happens, but in many larger organizations, they're generally accountable for the results, but not necessarily responsible for defining each of the aspects there. So in many cases, we may look at those folks as being informed as part of this engagement, and really deciding, hey, where we're going to work with them, how do we bring escalations to them, challenges and decision making. Frequently they're sitting on a steering committee of some sort as we work through this. And then as we think of like co-create and enablement, you know, this is where your line level leadership largely sits in many of these environments. And we've got to be very deliberate about what we're asking them to do here and where they fall on the spectrum of, let's say, promoters to detractors. So you've got your champions, and then you've got your real strong opponents to what we're trying to accomplish. And so as you select folks to work on your projects, really understanding where people fall in those spectrums and what their motivation is for these projects is going to really help define whether we put them in that inspire, enable, or co-creator bucket. But in general, we find that it's very important that we have a critical mass of multiple people engaged at various levels really in the co-creation process. But for the most part, it's going to be your line level leadership who's going to be there seeking the input and enablement of some core promoters who will serve as champions in the course of this project. So we want to be very deliberate about who we choose and when we choose to engage them and kind of where we put them in various categories to set ourselves up for success here. What happens if we don't do that? Ultimately, if we go back to this initial slide, we're likely to increase the political complexity and the inertial complexity of getting these things done and off the ground and adopted well. So you'll find differences of opinion, differences of understanding of what the outcomes need to be of the various systems that we're implementing. So if I can't get my marketing leadership and my sales leadership to agree on the definition of what a marketing qualified lead is or what a sales qualified lead is, then what we're going to end up with is a lot of noise and distraction when we get into actually deploying the environment for those who we've inspired or enabled to give us some of these ideas. They're going to feel pretty frustrated, and we're going to see low adoption, we're going to see lower usage rates, and we're going to see increased support costs in terms of administration and other things like that as we go through this. So this is really critical as far as just putting the groundwork together and understanding who's involved, how they're involved, which processes they're responsible for, and getting a great kind of a pre-footing for how to move ahead with either a new implementation or enhancements in the Salesforce ecosystem. Now from there, once we've defined where these people fit in terms of influence on the project itself, we want to slot them into an appropriate systems governance model. Now, a lot of organizations don't really spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to set this up and how we're going to divide up responsibility across the entire organization. But we find that by establishing a steering committee, an operating committee, and giving clear delineation of responsibility for different pieces of the project, different business processes, and how do we make decisions on what's worthy of investment and maybe what's going to be put on hold or what's not going to be done, really streamlines that process of getting things to the end of an adoptable state as fast as possible. So once you understand who your steering committee is and some basic things on a steering committee, these are generally executive level folks who are making financial decisions for an organization and steering the overall outcome of the business, right? They're the ones who are signing the checks ultimately. And so they're the ones that really need to be able to decide, hey, how much money are we willing to invest in this? And what do we expect to get out of that? And then the operating committee is ultimately those line level leaders. So again, in that Sales Cloud instance, I've got a marketing leader generally, and I've got sales leaders, and I might have business line leaders in terms of product offerings or service offerings that may be involved there. But these are the folks who are really defining and optimizing the processes. They're the ones who are reporting back to that executive leadership and saying, hey, here's what we need to do to achieve the business outcomes that we're looking for. And they're the ones that are going to be involved in the vast majority of that plan, design, deliver, adopt, and manage type process there. Now with that, we don't want to underestimate the value of really looking at project management, change management, and ultimate compliance. So project management plays a really significant factor in the doing of the work to actually implement that. So whether that's defining the meetings that need to be had and the involvement of who is going to be where and when. That's really critical in every phase of the project as we make decisions, as we work through the evaluations of whether we're meeting our overall project and implementation objectives. That person is really responsible for keeping everybody on track and keeping everybody aligned with the ultimate business goals that we set. So sometimes we get in there and we say, hey, this would be really cool if we could do X, Y, Z. I'd love to automate these 10 things, right? And that may be really beneficial for the business at some point, but it may be at odds with the timeline that we've set. It may be at odds with the budget that we've set. And so again, your project management is really designed there to help keep us within the box that we've prescribed for the project, that we've determined, hey, within these parameters, we can feel successful. And then from there, if we feel like we need to change the box, size, shape, whatever that might look like, we can take that back to the steering committee and get approval or disapproval, whatever it might be for those processes there. And that keeps everybody understanding, hey, what the process is as we go through that. Now, in addition to project management, there's this idea of change management. And change management is very different from just, hey, here's a change request, we're going to modify this in the project. Change management is really focused on really setting expectations for how we're going to help people understand what it is we're doing, why we're doing it, and what are the benefits that they're going to get out of that. So this is really that human interaction. And so generally, what I would say is we need to have our operating committee or a specific person who is responsible for their people and really being a voice of why we're doing this, how we're going to get there, really surfacing any core questions that may be coming up out of that. And when we find that this is not well managed or organized, what happens in the course of the project is you lean really, really heavily on the UAT type process to collect feedback and to do a lot of training. And that can frequently derail the project outcomes because we've not set good expectations with the folks who actually have to use the system, who are influencing that. And we end up with this input and ideas. We end up with a lot of it just kind of randomly near the end of the project, and that's not ideal. So what we want to do is we want to set those expectations up front. We want to help people understand when and who should have that voice, how we aggregate that information so it's manageable, and then what the process is for actually getting to adoption and change, and where certain people are going to be involved. So that change manager, really internally with an organization, whether it's a line level person or a deliberately focused individual on those things, is really critical. And then ultimately compliance is the responsibility of the leadership, operating committee, steering committee, project management, everybody saying, hey, we've agreed on the ground rules and we're going to stick to that. When we're not bought in on the compliance portion of how we framed a project and what we've done, and there is no frame of reference, then that sets us up for some really significant challenges there. So again, going back to ultimate decision making, and you think of that promoter versus detractor type scenario. If we're putting people who are likely more on the detractor side or even in the neutral kind of camp of what we're trying to accomplish, then that's going to really make it a challenge to work through the compliance aspect of what we're trying to achieve and where we're working with. So I'll pause there. We've got a few folks on the call. Any questions so far? This is kind of setting the groundwork for, hey, understanding who we are, what do we need to really be successful and to get a return on investment here? So I got a question in the chat. No questions. All right. All right, so we'll continue on from there. So now we've got our framework. We know who's involved. We know how they're involved. We know that they're bought into the project, and we know what it is that we're going to accomplish. Now, as an organization, we need to decide, exactly what is it that we're going to do, because you're going to do this more than once. You're not going to just do this on the initial implementation. You're going to have enhancements. You're going to go and you're going to add Sales Cloud, and then you're going to add Service Cloud, and then you're going to add a community. You might add CPQ or field service or an integration, right? So there's lots of things that we can do that are really good for the organization. But you've got to ask yourself a couple of questions, and as you think about that operating committee, that steering committee, what's going to be the best value and have the biggest impact on the business the quickest, right? So think about a couple of things here as you're working through that. If I have an organization of several hundred people, my capacity for change is likely less than an organization of 10, right? The amount that I can ask my people to consume and what they're willing to work through is going to be more challenging when I have more complexity, more people, more things to deal with. And so being very deliberate about what we're going to do and when we're going to do it is going to have a huge influence there. And so regardless of what we think the business value might be, if I can't get adoption, if I can't get acceptance, if I can't get buy-in from the people who are actually using these systems, then they're essentially very expensive Rolodexes or just data collection tools that may not actually be collecting any data because we're still doing stuff in spreadsheets or we're working around the system in various ways. So if I can't get people to buy in, then everything else doesn't matter, right? So then we think about, okay, great. I'm going to prioritize this. I understand what we can do. I know I can get certain people to make certain changes here. I'm not coming right out of 5 other huge initiatives that have created a lot of change fatigue. So we're going to embark on some sort of business change. We're going to add a software. We're going to change our processes. We're going to create customization, whatever it might be within the environment. So what's going to add the most business value? Is it significantly increasing the amount of marketing that we're doing? Is it building a system to actually manage field technicians and route them appropriately? There's a lot of tools and options that are out there available. So I think it's really important that you sit down and you establish, hey, what is the business value? And everybody's clear on what we expect to see out of our objectives, right? So I'm going to increase sales by 50%. I'm going to increase my close rate. I'm going to reduce handle time or reduce my travel time to service locations. Whatever those business objectives are, let's be very clear on what we're trying to achieve. And as we look at that, we can make an evaluation of how much is too much, how much is too little in terms of level of effort and investment to actually achieve what we're looking to achieve. So if my goal is to reduce handle times by 40%, right? What I might actually do to implement that type of service change would be very different than if I said, hey, I need to reduce my handle times by, or my total call volume by 80%, right? So I might say, hey, one of them is more of a knowledge type implementation in Salesforce where I need to give my reps access to information faster, and then the routing needs to go to the right people. So omni-channel and that type of thing, versus a community with case deflection, chatbots, other things like that, where I'm actually trying to minimize the amount that I have service agents engaged. So what's the business objective, and are we clear on the overall outcomes there? From that point, then we can compare and contrast. We might have multiple things that we want to do. What's it going to cost us to get things done in terms of both money, licenses, investment in hardware, software, whatever it might be, and people cost, right? How much time are they going to put in? What are we taking them away from? Opportunity cost, etc. And then saying, okay, great. What are we actually going to do to drive adoption, right? How are we going to incentivize that? That's a big part of some of the costs. So, if you're working with a sales organization, they're always going to say, hey, what's in it for me? Why should I do this differently when I was just fine before? So is it a carrot or is it a stick model, or is it a bit of both to really get there? So looking at that and defining that, hey, how am I actually going to encourage people to stick with this? You've heard the saying, hey, if it doesn't exist in Salesforce, then it doesn't exist. Are you really bought into that? And are all of your stakeholders bought into that? Because if you let that one sales rep who's amazing work outside the system and you never take action around that, that's going to cause a cascading impact on adoption of the other users, right? So you have to plan for that and you have to be committed to it from the beginning. So we've decided we're going to do something, whatever it might be. And now we need to say, okay, great. Salesforce is a phenomenal platform. I can just build it myself. I've got custom objects, I've got code, I've got flows, I've got lots of really cool things that I can do. And I can build out my own processes and architectures as I do that. And that's totally fine and totally acceptable. However, it does come with a cost. And you've got to think about this as a broader strategy as far as where you're going to take things. Do I want to go and build and maintain that? And again, depending on complexity and what's going on there, you've got to be committed to maintaining that. And for organizations where you have a full-time staff of resources on board, you've got a developer, you've got a project manager, you've got a solution architect, you've got whoever it might be that really knows their stuff when it comes to Salesforce or integrations or other things like that. Building might be okay, but you've also set yourself up for a potential retention issue. Salesforce is a very competitive marketplace, and people who really know their stuff tend to get poached. And as soon as you put on LinkedIn that, hey, I know XYZ about Salesforce, they're going to get hit up by the recruiters at least weekly, if not more frequently. So you've got to keep that in mind. We have found that when you're looking at building and maintaining a customized environment and really maintaining the salary of that over the course of 3 to 5 years, it's actually in many cases cost prohibitive. It might sound good to do that up front, but to do it well, to maintain it well, and to be really bought in, especially with some degree of complexity, you're going to spend with high customization and maintenance maybe $2.5 million over, like I said, the course of 5 years or so, just to maintain that. Now, when you go out and you buy stuff off the shelf and you use some of the standard architecture that exists in Salesforce, you buy some of those products, your cost of maintenance and overall implementation is reduced. And the nice thing is that you can start to take maybe a bit of a hybrid model in terms of, hey, who do I have internally as far as resources that are available for you, right? So it's going to be much easier to have a more of a junior type resource that you can keep on staff, and then leverage some consulting expertise as needed, or some freelance work, or whatever it might be, to do some of the more complex stuff that you don't have experience and exposure to. You can get things done faster, you can reduce the complexity, and you can make it a lot easier to, again, when you lose some talent, replace them and keep them on staff. So as we look at our clients who are doing things in both of these ways, we find that as you're looking at the costs and the way to go about doing that, having more of a hybrid approach is much more efficient, assuming that you're saying, hey, I can buy into those established processes. I can do CPQ out of the box instead of writing a bunch of custom quote calculators. I can use field service the way it's designed to use and change my business process to accept some of the out of the box requirements that are available with Salesforce, right? Instead of doing customization for everything. So really think about what's your secret sauce, what am I committed to internally? Because really quickly, if you spend $2.5 million over 5 years just to maintain an environment, you may have completely eroded any sort of business return on investment. that you expected to have at the beginning, just in terms of maintenance, technical debt, and overall business outcomes. So going back to this, right? Understand the business value, and then understand the cost to get there. If in 5 years you're going to see $1 million benefit, but it costs you $2.5 million to get there, probably not the best path to take. So, I talked about this for a second. In-house versus consultants versus a hybrid approach. We generally like the hybrid approach for a number of reasons. We could say, hey, like, we're consultants. Go use consultants all the time. You'll get great value out of that, which you would. But I think with Salesforce and a lot of these other environments, there's a lot that you can leverage from a system administrator, whether they're an accidental admin, whether they're really a professional admin dedicated to doing good things in Salesforce. There is value to having somebody like that on staff, and giving them access to people who do this all day long and who are experiencing the depth and breadth of the Salesforce ecosystem across multiple industries on occasion. You don't need the consultants all the time, but you don't need that super high value unicorn of a resource that's a developer, that's a project manager, that's a system architect, that knows everything that there could ever possibly be to know about Salesforce. That person is going to be very expensive, very hard to retain, and very hard to find in the first place. So again, we would recommend, as you're thinking about this, understand that time to value makes a big difference, and the overall experience and exposure and access to an entire team of people when you're working with most Salesforce consulting environments. There's a lot of value to be had in there, but don't get stuck with just a single consultant. You want somebody who's willing to work with you and bring in their expertise at the right time as necessary. When you do that and you work in those models, you can get things done a lot faster, a lot more efficiently, and ultimately achieve your business results quickly. So one example of that is we had a client who they had essentially 4 full-time Salesforce admins on staff, and they were all basically accidental admins. They were all technically competent people, but they were not what I would call Salesforce professionals. They were doing it because, hey, you seem to know what you're doing. You can figure out Salesforce. It's not that hard. And that was great. Unfortunately, they lost all 4 of those people within a couple of months of each other. And so they were left a bit high and dry. And they came to us and said, hey, help us understand this. I need to replace 4 people. What would it cost to have 4 consultants come in here and fill the gap? And we said, really interesting question. I don't think you need 4 people. I think we can probably do this with 1 person and a little bit of assistance from some of our expert resources from time to time. And we have supported that environment at 1/4 the efficiency, right, with in terms of people, but we've gotten everything done that they were doing previously. Now, the other impact that environment has, as this organization has gone out and acquired other organizations that did have Salesforce, is they accrued a lot of technical debt over time. And the org, because it wasn't professionally managed, it was challenging to stay on top of, requires a lot of tribal knowledge. And they're actually looking at some of the better managed environments that they've acquired over time and saying, hey, we're going to abandon this core Salesforce environment. We're going to migrate to something more robustly put together with less quirks and stay on top of that. So again, fully in-house where you've got less experience, less to draw from, and just kind of solving problems as they're thrown at you instead of kind of having a really well-organized big picture scenario with a proper governance process, you end up with a lot more technical debt. That has a really significant cost to it over time. You're always going to have technical debt, so it's never going to just be completely gone or mitigated. But as you think about that, you can create a good roadmap with that steering committee, that operations committee. You can minimize the impact that has on the environment. Going with consultants, you may get stuff done a lot faster, but you may ultimately spend a lot more money, but you do have fewer retention issues, right? You don't have to worry about, hey, who's going to be working on my project and who understands what we're doing. That's now the consulting company's responsibility. And if they're managing that well, they've got some parity in there, so you're mitigating your risk with that. But this is why we feel like that hybrid approach is the best way. You can gain parity, you can gain expertise, you can enhance your in-house resources as needed, and you can get a lot better time to value. So whether it's with us, whether it's with some of the other really fantastic Salesforce consulting groups out there, really would urge you to consider kind of that hybrid approach and staying engaged so that you can get better time to value and mitigate some of the risks of building your own org. So lastly, we'll wrap with this. How do I really get that value, right? In Salesforce, keep it simple. Don't try and do too much all at once because you can quickly make changes. Again, go back to, hey, what's our capacity for change? But if you can coach people and understand that we're going to do continuous improvement here, we're going to do small changes over time, you can really reduce a lot of the change fatigue that is happening through a good change management and communications plan. But if you've got the right people engaged, you've got your core stakeholders, you can get in there and you can define your business value. This is what I want to achieve as a business. This is the impact from a dollar value and a client and an employee impact. Great, let's go out and let's put that together quickly. We can get our team of promoters, we can get our development team, and we can put all these pieces together and organize that quickly so that we don't forget why we're doing it. We don't run the risk of business change, and we can get something ready to go and out there as quickly as possible. So in my opinion, most Salesforce environments should enhancements, even initial implementations in many cases, we should be looking to get value out of what we've got within 3 months or less. So rapid prototyping, what can I get, what can I start using and getting value out of the licenses that I'm paying for in 3 months or less. How do I do UAT? UAT is such a critical part of what we're trying to achieve. This is not a requirements gathering phase though. This is, hey, an opportunity for us to share what we've learned as we've done our analysis and design, what we've built, how that's going to really impact the organization, and to make small tweaks as we go through that. But this is a really great opportunity to provide constructive criticism and feedback, but those changes may not be made immediately. We're just going to look at the most critical items. And then finally, getting into a really robust deployment cycle, going back to that governance model, right? How frequently are we going to do this? Who's making those decisions? And is everybody as a team bought in? Steering committee, operating committee, line level folks, everybody who's involved there. So that's what I've got today. So any questions, anything that you guys would like to dig into outside of that? Okay. Well, I appreciate everybody taking the time. Hopefully there was some benefit here. If you guys have any questions, would like any support on establishing governance best practices, identifying, hey, where are we as an organization? What should we do? Feel free to reach out and we'd be glad to support you with that. All right, thanks everybody. Have a fantastic afternoon.